So I completed my internship here with the university, where I had a digital internship with Dr. Allison Mann. As we all know, Allison is the course coordinator of the Foundations course, and as a part of this role, she's conducting research on the effectiveness of video lectures within the Foundations course. Specifically, she's reviewing student feedback from the 2021 B.Ed school year on how students felt about the video lectures, where they were answering 4 questions about how they felt about it, looking at both the positives and negatives. So my role within her research process was to apply a method of qualitative data analysis known as coding to identify and flag patterns within the responses. So this type of coding shouldn't be confused with like computer coding or programming, right? The use of a computer coding language to give instructions to a computer to perform a task. It's not that. Instead, it's a method of organizing qualitative data by flagging relevant passages with a coded term or phrase to organize it with other passages comprised of the same general notion. So for example, if I were conducting research on people's favorite food, I might use coding to organize the responses into the food groups. So next to a response of filet mignon, I would write meat, whereas next to a response of ice cream, I would write dairy. And then by the end, I'd be left with a general understanding of which of the food groups is most popular. This categorization process is what is referred to as coding, and what it achieves is a symbolization or translation of data, and it attributes interpreted meaning to the data point that can then be used to identify patterns, to develop propositions, to build theories, and perform other methods of analysis. So essentially, I was taking in the raw qualitative data in the form of these written student feedback, and then I was coding or categorizing the responses according to recurring ideas. And then afterwards, Dr. Allison Mann is going to coalesce these categories to draw out larger themes from them. And then finally, it is from those themes that she will arrive at an assertion or a theory. So my motivation for choosing this internship was twofold, really. I wanted to build and develop new skills of data collection and analysis to potentially use in my own career, right, to collect and analyze student feedback on something new that I'm trying in my own classroom. Secondly, though, I also wanted to discover the positives and negatives of an increasingly popular teaching method, right, video lectures. So this internship was great in that I was able to combine these two curiosities that I had. So now I'll look into the inquiry question as well as the learning goals and success criteria for the internship. Reflective of that twofold interest, my inquiry question was, how can I use qualitative research methods such as coding to interpret student feedback to gauge the effectiveness of my teaching strategies? And then similarly, my learning goal and success criteria were the following. For the learning goal, it was, by the end of this digital internship, I aim to gain experience and develop skills in qualitative data analysis, especially coding, in order to interpret student feedback and simultaneously evaluate the effectiveness of video lectures within the classroom. For my success criteria, I had 5 criteria, the first of which was, I will develop a deep understanding of what qualitative data consists of and begin exploring methods of how to gather such data based on the examples that Dr. Mann has provided me with. Second, I will acquire coding skills that will allow me to analyze collected qualitative data. Third, I'll be able to interpret the collected data accurately, drawing relevant and clear conclusions that can inform adjustments to my own teaching practice. Fourth, I will gain a comprehensive understanding of the advantages and disadvantages associated with video lectures as a teaching strategy based on real reactions to it from students. And then finally, I will actively participate in real education research, furthering my understanding of what this process consists of. So next I'll look at the sort of framework that this was within. So in terms of framework, I especially wanted to develop these skills of data analysis to follow through Kolb's experimental learning cycle while I'm a teacher. So beginning with the concrete experience, that would be the new teaching strategy that you were trying to test, right? In this case, it was video lectures. Then you would have a reflective observation of considering what went well, what benefits you see from it, how the students reacted to it, and then the abstract conceptualization stage would be the coding process, because this is exactly what coding is. If you collected feedback during the reflective observation stage, then making sense and extracting meaning out of that feedback is the abstract conceptualization. Categorizing the responses, distilling them to their root ideas, and then identifying wider patterns to form a larger theme. And then it is those patterns and themes that would inform the adjustments and changes that you make as a part of the last stage of active experimentations. So if I wanted to use Kolb's experimental learning cycle with student feedback, coding I think is a really important skill to have to complete that cycle. So additionally though, even within the coding process itself and within my internship itself, we also went through the experimental learning cycle. Because the first time you read through the responses, you just jot down the central ideas that the answer was conveying. But you can't just leave it there because you might have 100 different words for 100 different answers. And so there really is no comprehensive framework that you're interpreting the data through. so you aren't really contributing to anything yet. So then you must pass into the reflective observation stage, where you go back over your work and begin to actually identify the patterns. It's also during this stage that I was talking with my supervisor and other people who have done this before, and they helped me to reflect on my initial categories. And then you move into the abstract conceptualization stage, where, after having read through the responses many times, you develop the final terminology that's going to make up your categories. And you really have to extract the root premises from the answers and figure out what it is being conveyed. For example, there was one student who reported that they found themselves unmotivated to complete the lecture videos, and I really had to stop and think about why. Ultimately, after much deliberation, I realized that this was likely an issue with engagement, where, because the student found the videos unengaging, it probably felt like a chore to complete each week, and thus they were unmotivated. So even though the word and idea of engagement was never brought up by the student, I still placed their answer within the category of engagement, because that is what you have to do when you're in that conceptualization stage. You're trying to make sense of their experience. Finally, the active experimentation stage I thought fit well with the inevitable need for subcategories, because once you have this precise terminology for classification, when you go to test those categories, you notice that there's a lot of variance within them. And so to refine it further and be more precise, you have to experiment with subcategories. But this is an experimentation process for sure, because as you're working through the responses, you really don't know which subcategories are going to stick or which ones you're going to break up or combine later. You end up going through many different classification systems, and it ultimately is a lot of trial and error. Next, though, I want to look at the results. And I'll do this by looking both at the coding process itself and also the results that we found about the video lectures. So looking at the coding process first, well, I learned a lot about what coding was. Now, most of what I learned I've already spoken about in my introduction part of this video, but that overview that I mentioned at the beginning was a combination of both what I learned from doing it, but then also based on two readings that I did. There was one reading from Auerbach and another from Saldana, which were both introductions to qualitative data analysis, going over what they are, how to do it, things like that. But to talk about the third reading that I did on the topic of coding, we should go back to that example of the unmotivated student that I placed within the engagement category, because it was really then that I started to realize that there's a lot of creativity that is required with coding, and you really have to apply yourself over top of the research. And that was the topic of this third reading that I did, which explored that very process and the need for creativity within coding in order for it to be effective. But this can feel really strange if, like me, you're much more used to quantitative data and working with like numbers and statistics, where you don't want to, insert yourself or anything too subjective into them. So this reading by Williams and Moser was extremely helpful for this creativity aspect and to reassure me that I wasn't acting wrongly when I was inserting my own understanding into the data, and that was a huge lesson to learn. And now about the video lectures themselves. As you might expect, I learned a ton about video lectures and how it is that students feel about them. So to summarize the research results, students said that the most common advantages were the ability to do them at any time on their own schedule, to do them at their own pace, right? So pausing the video or rewinding it or watching it at 2 times speed, and then the remote aspect of not having to drive to campus. And then finally, getting an introduction to the topic that the in-person lecture will be focusing on. Meanwhile, the most commonly cited disadvantages were that the fact that there was no social interaction, that there was no immediate feedback if you had a question or didn't fully understand something and wanted clarification, that it added to the workload for each week, and that some of the videos were very content heavy and felt like an info dump or led to cognitive overload. So these were great things to discover, and I found it super interesting and fun to be behind the scenes with Allison and having access to these students' like unfiltered opinions. It was anonymous, of course, but it was still very interesting to go through. And then I also wanted to know how our findings compared to what other researchers say. So I did a reading from the researcher Lapomi on this very topic, and I was very happy to find that our research findings basically overlapped exactly with what educational researchers say were their findings with lecture videos. However, there is one important exception that I want to go over in my conclusion, and that's what we'll turn to now. Overall, I think that the internship went extremely well. I've learned a ton about coding and video lectures, and I definitely feel as though I've achieved my learning goals and fulfilled each of my success criteria. However, as I mentioned, there was one thing in the research that did not really come up in our responses, and that is the issue of accessibility, especially when it comes to access to technology and high-speed internet. The final source that I used was from the United Nations, and that was a comprehensive study of how each country had to respond and adapt their education system during COVID. And what they found was that within the world, and even within individual countries, there's still a very large digital divide. And that refers to the gap between demographics and regions that have access to reliable technology and high-speed internet. Basically, what we see is that in developed urban areas, the internet infrastructure and technology is present and is there for everybody, or nearly everybody, but outside of urban centers, very much less so. And often ethnic minorities and other disadvantaged groups don't have the same access that non-minority populations have. And unfortunately, things like internet and infrastructure is required for video lectures to be possible as a teaching method. And so this method worked at Ontario Tech because all the students have good internet access, and the vast majority of them live in well-developed urban or suburban settings. But this is not the case for the entire country, and much less for the entire world. It's interesting because in our minds, when we think about COVID and remote learning, we associate it with tech tools like Zoom especially, and also video lectures. But actually, for much of the world, remote learning was done through physical take-home packages because access to technology and high-speed internet was not present or fully reliable. So then, to me, the question becomes, can we truly recommend video lectures as a universally good teaching strategy when it relies on specific infrastructure that not all the world enjoys? And in fact, this isn't even a problem just for far-away developing countries, but even here within Canada, there's a strong digital divide. For example, Indigenous communities often lack high-speed internet, and as do other rural areas. And these accessibility issues are very real and I think limit the effectiveness and attractiveness of video lectures as a teaching strategy. And so I think this is a direction that future research on this topic needs to go in. How can we make video lectures more accessible? And is there a way to accommodate for the digital divide with the video lectures so we're not leaving students behind due to things that they can't control? Otherwise, that concludes my video, and thank you.